Hello again everyone, welcome back to another episode of Catalan opening series, where we talk about Catalan openings and all the ideas and components, and so we can apply those into our games. Now maybe you're clicking on this video because you're bored, or maybe you're clicking this video because you're looking for another inspiration onto your Catalan opening, or you're just looking for some ideas to surprise your opponents. In any case, I'm just hoping that you can get some value out of this video. Whatever that goal may be, I've decided to put out everything that I've known onto this video so that you can actually just apply those into your games. Now in the Catalan position, there are probably two lines that we have talked about, mainly after pawn takes c4. We talk about knight to e5 in this position being the main line, also queen c2, which everybody seems to be playing nowadays. But there are these little moves called sidelines that may not be so popular among, just chess players in general. And very quickly, the move that I want to draw your attention to is queen to a4. Now queen to a4 seems to be violating chess principle. The first is black would like to play pawn to a6, and after queen takes c4, we might see pawn to b5, and let's say queen to c2, queen to d3 is good, queen to b3 is good, but let's just say queen to c2 as the main move. You might have just seen that the queen has just moved 3 squares from a4 to c4 back to c2. This does not only violate the principle of bringing the lady out as early in the game, but also just moving your pieces multiple times in the opening is just bad as well. And so why is this opening actually just playable? Well, there are many debates actually, because after, let's say, black move bishop to b7, which is a natural development move for black, white would actually like to play bishop to f4, which attacks the c7 pawn right now. And there are many arguments being that this c7 pawn is just going to be weak for the rest of the game, because let's say if you move a pawn to c6 just to get it out of the attack, no, of course you just block your knight development on c6, of course you just block your bishop as well. And if you move it to c5 and pawn takes, there is no definitive way to actually take back the pawn on c5. This pawn is protected by the queen, and if queen c8, let's say perhaps you can just play rook c1 to protect this pawn. Very possible, and there's no way to get back this pawn as immediately as possible, and black's just slightly worse over here. And a lot of times black is just forced to play knight to c6, which again protects the c pawn quite awkwardly in this position, but also tries to take on d4 here, along with the queen. Now what's amazing about this position is that you can play knight to c3, and if your opponent doesn't really know this line, or if your opponent is a beginner, or if your opponent is not very familiar, he can just take this pawn on d4, which is a mistake, because after knight to d4, you cannot take on d4 because bishop to b7, the bishop hangs here, and you just have a piece. And let's say if you flip the move order with bishop to g2, well, you don't really have to recapture on g2, do you? You can insert the move rook to d1 and prepares the move of knight to e6. And so let's say if the bishop moves to h3, for example, you can just play knight to e6, forking the rook and the queen. Say the queen moves to c8, you win a rook here, and yeah, this position should be better for you. And if bishop to e6, you can just take the queen, and yeah, this position should be better for you after, let's say, bishop to c7. You're up a queen and you're pressing into the position, this should be very, very good for you. And let's say if your opponent does know the line and plays bishop to d6, then I suppose something like knight to e5 is also just very good. Just taking the advantage you have the space on the center of the board. And yeah, I think you still have a better middle game prospects. With rook to d1 coming, pawn to e4 maybe. And let's just say if the knight moves to h5, attacking the bishop on f4, the bishop could have just moved to e3, and everything will be fine that way as well. The knight slightly misplaced on h5, it can be moved back later on, but it's just going to lose time. The best move for white here is probably knight to b4, attacking the queen, and after queen to d2, you can perhaps expect something like knight to d5 here in this position, where it fights for the center, attacking the bishop on f4, and if trade, he just trade. This should be okay as well for black. And or the more straightforward move of pawn to c5. This, targets the pawn on d4, getting rid of the weaknesses on c7, and if the pawn takes, you can take the bishop, everything is fine here for black. And if you get into this position, perhaps it will be an equal endgame with queen to d8, rook to d8, but in general this might be a creative way to play against the Catalan with queen to a4, also as an idea to surprise your opponent. But at least I can say that if your opponent is total beginner, he will take the pawn on d4, in which you can just take on d4, and yeah, he's just fallen into your trap, but does not capture it quite immediately. And there's something that I want to remind you guys of in this position, and that is try not to play too creative in this position. Some of you might thought, oh, knight c3 is a good move, because he can't play b5. Well, in total fact, he can, and after knight to b5, hoping that pawn takes on b5, queen to a8, it does not work that way, man, because here there is bishop to d7, pinning down your knight to the queen, and if queen moves, let's say to d1, yeah, you're just going to lose your piece for nothing, and so the knight c3 move is actually very bad. Then if you play something like rook to d1, you still have b5, and yeah, Unless you're trying to sacrifice a pawn, then perhaps just don't go for this one. Here it is still best to take on c4 and hope for the worst thing that can happen onto your opponent. Another sideline that I want to include is knight to c3. This is also not very popular move because it's strange to leave this pawn hanging on c4, not taking it immediately. Besides, what's actually the plan after knight c6? In this position, e4 is still possible, but you're not looking to really push to d5 because let's say after pawn to a6 here, the plan is still the same with pawn to b5, protecting the pawn on c4. You still cannot push d5 because just after the exchange here, we can just go knight to a5. This actually just protect the pawn on c4. Just, threaten to go to b3 if the pawn ever marches forward. In any case, it makes life more difficult for white to push for b3 right here. And so definitely d5 is not the plan after you push on e4. You perhaps might want to stop pawn to b5 from coming with pawn to a4, the move that I've been talking about earlier as well, to stop the move b5. But in this position, you're also just giving up the square on b3 again. Completely giving it up after knight to a5. We can just go to b3 next turn, and there's nothing that can kick us away. And so let's just say you follow the engine move of queen to e2 here. After knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4. If you play rook to d1, there's something like queen to c5. In any case, you're down 2 pawns in this kind of position, and you're probably slightly worse if you can't actually make a justification of that particular sacrifice that you just made. And so if e4 is just a very difficult move to play, what do you even do? You can play knight to e5 again, but you still lose the pawn on d4. You can get the pawn on c4 back, but I guess the compensation is that you can have the bishop open, the knight is more active into the center of the board. You can just push the pawn on e4, pawn to e5. But still in this position, you're just down a pawn, and you have to be completely fine defending a position down a pawn, find a counterplay against it basically. But knight c3 is still something that you could have tried for if you're feeling creative on the day of playing. Now the last line that I think you could have played is also knight to d2, threatening to win this pawn back. But after pawn to b5, you will hope that there's knight to e5. But no, there is knight to d5 blocking up the position. But indeed, you can play pawn to b3 just to be creative. And the pawn takes, queen takes. You get your queen out, you get a knight out pretty quickly, bishop to b2 or to a3 is possible. I believe you also have talked about this possibility before on the Richard Report game from the very first review games. But in the end, of course, you're just still down a pawn and you have to be ready to defend this kind of position. And also to make the justification of the sacrifice that you've made. In this position, you also could have played knight to a3. But of course, after bishop to a3, pawn to a3, you have to be able to justify this kind of pawn structure as well. I believe we've talked about this in the first review games as well. But all in all, these are all the moves that you can try to actually surprise your opponents, to get your opponent out of preparation, perhaps win some games. And with that said, I just want to wrap up this video quickly so I can move on to the review games to actually understand more about the concept. As usual, if you like this video, please press the like button and also the subscribe button. That will actually help to motivate me more to actually just create more of this video. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. See you soon.